Hello, this is Eric Lussier. I used to go by the radio name of Eric D, and I suppose I still could do so, but since I pressed record and I said Eric Lussier, well, so be it. And I have a confession to make. I am a recovering commercial radio listener. And not only that, but I actually went to school to be a radio DJ. Way back when, now that I think of it, 1993. The New England School of Broadcasting, now called the New England School of Communications, in Bangor, Maine. September 93 to May of 94. And I'd actually signed up to be in their associates program. It was their first year. They were going to offer a 2-year in associates. And I found out about a couple of weeks into the whole thing that second year really wasn't going to be necessary. I was going to, at least in my opinion, get what I needed to out of school by nose to the grindstone in that first year. And that's what I did. I had a show, a fun show. I still look back on it very fondly, called Sight for Sore Ears, that I did with my college roommate, Dennis. And I ran a skimmer tape, which for those in the industry would know, but for those of you who aren't and are listening, basically records when the microphone turns on and does not record the music themselves. And we use those for basically review, critique. And what I used those for after college was a chance to go back and listen to what I was doing on the air. And I remember a friend at the time saying, this would be so great if we could hear these songs that you're playing. Well, unfortunately, the skimmer tapes probably still exist, or at least some of them, but the music only lives on in the memory. Well, fast forward through, let's see, an internship at Corman the Coach at 106.7 WIZN in Burlington, and then being suggested on to 92.9 WEZF in the 40th and Allen in Colchester, Vermont. I delved into commercial radio. I took an overnight job at a 100,000 watt radio station right outside of Burlington that had a really big, far reach. And had a good time at first, and really early on was brought into the office of the program manager, a wonderful gentleman who basically sat me down and said, look, I'm doing a favor for my sister and hiring her son, and I want to have him train with you. I want you to teach him everything you know about radio. And then it was basically shown to me, so to speak, that I took my year of training at New England School of Broadcasting, and it dumbed and boiled down to one quick hour or two with a gentleman where I taught him really the ins and outs of radio and what you needed to know. Well, he's still around in the broadcasting industry, so to speak, but I really became disillusioned with commercial radio at the time. I did, I don't know, perhaps a year or two, not even, at WEZF, and then one night they changed formats, and they basically said, we don't want you to talk on the radio tonight, we just want you to play this music. Well, I was already playing music that I didn't enjoy for basically minimum wage, and I evaluated whether or not this was really bringing me happiness. So I decided to leave WEZF, and not too terribly long after, went over to WWPV, which is St. Michael's College Radio in Colchester, Vermont as well, a town I now live in now, and volunteered for an afternoon show on Saturdays. Starting in April of 1998, my oldest daughter was just born. The Higher Ground nightclub had just opened in Winooski, Vermont at the time. And I started a new show, and I called it Let It Roll. And it was based around what I called the live improvisational groove jam scene because of my love of the band Fish and some other bands in that genre, such as the Grateful Dead and the Allman Brothers and Widespread Panic, and a lot of the bands that were coming already to Higher Ground. I was there on night one, April 15th of 1998. When the band Everything from the DC area opened up for Agents of Good Roots. I had my recording gear in tow and started live taping. I had already done that previously at Club Metronome and Club Toast and some places around Burlington, and had been running sound for the band Currently Nameless, who I traveled and ran our shows live sound for and archived and tour managed and what have you, and I was recording for them for a couple of years. Well, I was taking my recordings and playing them on the air. It wasn't anything that was commercially available. Archive.org really wasn't a thing at the time. And I was taking my DAT tapes and playing them back over the air for people, sometimes as soon as 12 hours after the show was done, because I would be at Higher Ground the night before, and I'd be playing some of the live music the night after. Morning after, well, let's say afternoon. It started at high noon was the show. And I, after a little while, smartened up and started taking my live recordings and was recording the whole show at the same time. So not only was my skimmer tape now all of my on-air talking, but I was actually getting the music as well. And I was sharing some of those recordings in places and sharing that with friends and just getting that out there, because it was getting a lot of my recordings out there and making it more of a public domain type of thing. Well, I still have those recordings and look back at them very fondly, because it was kind of like sometimes the best of what had gone on that week or that month for me. And I'll always remember on one of Higher Ground's anniversaries, I believe it was year 1. So for April 15th, 1999, what I did was I took all of my favorite recordings from Higher Ground in 1998 and I gave them to the then 4 owners, Alex Crothers and Kevin Staitzer and Matt Suddy and Rob. Oh, my apologies, Rob. I'm spacing on your last name, my friend. I ended up running Rob's tape deck, his DAT deck, for years at the old Higher Ground, and I have recordings that I still treasure greatly today. Listen to them all the time, and one of the reasons why I can't get rid of my CDs is because a lot of them are burned down to there, so that is the one outlet I can have. Fortunately, my DAT deck has lived on. It's given me some fits a little bit here and there, but more or less for when I use it, it works accurately. So I had a radio show for 4 years. It was called Let It Roll, every Saturday afternoon from noon until 3. The wonderful and extremely talented DJ Craig Mitchell came in after me. I befriended Craig, who is just one of the most generous, warm, friendly people I ever had a chance to meet in the industry, and turn over the FM dial 88.7 to Craig on those Saturdays. Well, I remember very early on, well, I can't say early on, I really guess I should say towards the end, it was just ended up being too much of a burden for me to be on every afternoon or every Saturday afternoon. And as I was a volunteer member, it was just unfortunately starting to become a strain at that time. So I decided to pull myself back off the airwaves. And the one big venture I have had on the FM dial around the Burlington area was on the Radiator, as they were starting to kick off their time when they were on College Street. And I got involved there before I moved to Pennsylvania in 2004 and was doing some time, much with the same recordings and same format, to do Let It Roll there on the Radiator, which is a great local low-watt FM station that Lee Anderson from Radio Bean basically put together. So 2004, when I did move to Pennsylvania, I had the utmost privilege of working in an amazing industry for an interesting lady. We did music publishing, and for those that are not aware of that side of the music industry, it is basically where the songwriting credits and copyrights are actually administered and licensed for income use by the songwriters. So all of your recordings that you know are actually licensed in 2 different ways, and you have the publishing rights and then you have the master recording rights. Well, we worked for essentially George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelics music catalog, which at that time was primarily not owned by George, because apparently in what the story was, a crack-infused haze and necessity signed over the rights to a record label owner. And for 3 years, I helped basically administer his copyrights, and we were involved in the largest rap and hip-hop lawsuit in history. And during that time that I worked for this company, music streaming, not even streaming, music digital downloads were coming to light. And we were working with licensing agencies trying to figure out what the proper mechanical royalty rates are. And the iTunes store was coming to light, and there was really a new realm of music streaming and music availability that was getting up away from albums and tapes and compact discs and was going towards the digital realm. So then really a few years later, I would suppose, after streaming and downloads became more of a norm, streaming is really not where it was today by any means. Napster was certainly out there. Podcasts kind of came to light. And I remember thinking, what a horrible name. And it was really named because of the iPod, something that I had pushed back on for many, many years. And I understood that, well, these podcasts are kind of neat, but they are very talking based. And talking and radio don't really go hand in hand in the long form edition. They certainly did on the podcast networks, but not on traditional radio unless you listen to talk radio or sports radio. I was always a fan of both, but I always missed the musical component of it because after a while the solo voice becomes tiring and it's hard to listen to one voice for a long time. So what I had done when I was on WWPV was I'd basically open up the microphone every 45 minutes, and it actually coincided to the flip of a tape. So I'd talk for 3-4 minutes, talk about what was going on, mainly about the music, and then I would play music for about 40 minutes straight. Then I'd back sell, play a PSA, flip the tape, and do the same thing again. So in a 3-hour show, I'd basically only talk 6 times. Sometimes I'd talk too long. I tend to get that way, and my apologies for that. I wanted to put forward a little bit of a backstory before I jumped into music. But anyways, I certainly had that apprehension for getting into podcasting because, especially as someone that worked in music copyright, I knew that you can't just take any publicly produced song and put it out for the airways for people to download and use because it's essentially a musical copyright violation. Do you remember when the RIAA was basically suing everyone they could get a hold of due to Napster? It got a little crazy there for a time, and basically there were moms that were receiving lawsuits because their teenage son was using the family computer to download through Napster, and the RIAA basically didn't care about who was using it. They just saw the IP address and were putting out lawsuits. For those that don't know, the RIAA is the Recording Industry Association of America. And there were a lot of lawsuits that came down during the Napster and LimeWire turmoil of the early days. And you can't really say it shook out. It may have just gone away, but certainly people were very aware of some of these fines that come in through the RIAA. So when I did want to do podcasting early on, I wanted to include music because it was such an important component of my life, and it always has been. But I always held off. I have had a couple of podcasts under my belt over the last 2 years, but they were based on different talk formats. One was the construction industry, the industry I've basically been working in for the last 15 years, where I hosted a podcast called Let's Fix Construction. And then another one that was just for fun, and it was called Riff On. And they both still exist, and you can find them out there. Well, Anchor kind of came to light, I guess, last year, and it really kind of caught my attention because the idea, I believe, is that it was making podcasting easier and more accessible. So I was aware of Anchor and what they were doing, and was apprehensive to jump right into it because I want to make sure that my audio is owned. But last week, things got shooken up even more in the podcasting industry, as I'm aware of it, at least, in that Spotify had bought Anchor. Spotify has gone whole hog into podcasting over the last year, where they basically bought the Ringer podcasting network and have exclusive licensing agreements with Joe Rogan, two of the big names on the podcasting industry as of late. And as a Spotify user of the past 7 years, maybe, including a premium user for the last 2, the thing that caught my attention was the ability to use Spotify and their music and their streams to incorporate them into podcasts and further allow the artists to get paid for the usage of their music. And we know that the streaming rights aren't paying a whole heck of a lot. You're talking about something around 0.0006 cents per stream or something like that. But numbers matter, and they all got to start somewhere. A local, now Burlington artist, Ryan Montbleu, who you'll be hearing on this show, said he paid for his mortgage with Spotify streams at one point in time. But you're talking about a great number needed. And one of his songs, I believe it was a cover of Tracy Chapman's Fast Car with Tall Heights, got on a prominent playlist that had millions and millions of streams. And as a result, he was paid and covered a mortgage payment. So the money is out there. But this announcement last week, or it was a few weeks ago, but I just became aware of it earlier last week, that Spotify and Anchor were basically out there now to be able to utilize podcasting and music available on Spotify, was a real eye-opener to me, while also demonstrating that this is exactly what podcasting should be. It's not about just the voice. It's not about just talking. It's about the music. Now, at one point in time, commercial radio was about the music as well. Heck, we've still got a radio station around here in Burlington that still says it promote being about the music. But when it comes down to it, it's driven by advertisers. There is still music that is being pushed and played while so much is ignored. And it's just not what it used to be. There's so many other locations that you can get your music nowadays. Why bother going to commercial radio when everything is on demand? And that was the beauty of the podcast, ultimately, is things were on demand. I had a 3-month trial of XM just run out that I got with repair of my van, and this is the 3rd or 4th or 5th time I've had XM, and every time I've just been shown how disappointing, really, I believe the service is in their programming, in that a couple of stations that are good, the programming is still piss poor in my opinion. Well, so the time has really come to maybe change that, and if this podcasting thing is really going to stick around, and obviously it is, and we can partner it with music, which is extremely important, I'm throwing my hat in the ring. I'm hoping that you're still with me, and I'm hoping that you're going to come back for more, because I'm kind of a spontaneous sharer, and I'm going to have no theme as these podcasts go on. But the first one that I wanted to put out there was all about some music that has really impacted my life just in the last couple of years, in that it has brought a whole new format into my life that I really used to ignore. If you had asked me before 2 years ago, would I like to listen to? My answer was always anything but country. And that's because I was most familiar with country music due to the bubblegum pop that is on locally here on a radio station, 98.9 WOKO. And if you've listened to it before or listened to Top 40 Country, you know what it's dominated by. The same artists and the same songs over and over and over again. I worked in an office in 96 time frame that played 98.9 on the radio in the office. And I think it's because they advertised on it, but also because there were some country music fans there. Well, in my 4 or 5 months that I worked at this company, I swear I only heard 45 different songs. And not only that, but most of them were pretty piss poor songs, in my opinion. And so I just always had a bad taste in my mouth when it came to country music. Well, a handful of years ago, Chris Stapleton got on my radar, and his songwriting style was very different. And not only that, but his songs were out there as well. And he had a couple of other bands that were available. One of them called the Johnson Brothers, that was his rock and roll outlet. And then the other was called the Steel Drivers, and that was his bluegrass outlet. Both of them were his songs, just played in those styles. But yet his country stuff was great too. Like, really great. The band was phenomenal. The themes were a little bit all over the place. I always took a liking to the fact that he liked to write a lot about whiskey and pot smoking, but a lot about love lost as well. And his songs were different. And there was a meaning behind them and thought behind them, and it wasn't the same bubblegum that was on the radio. So I really started to listen to a lot of Chris Stapleton, and he opened me up towards another artist that I really got to enjoy, and that was Sturgill Simpson. And Sturgill, country rooted at heart, had a lot of punk and a lot of rock and roll in him. A lot of funk at one point in time, too. If you listen to some of Sturgill's back catalog, he's got the Budos Band horns on one of his releases. Well, through Spotify and Sturgill Simpson, I was introduced to Tyler Childers. And this was Tyler before he became who he is now, and that's really on the scene. But I got to see Tyler Childers a few years ago at Higher Ground before he really broke it. And in those months approaching that show, I was listening to him almost nonstop. And what's great about some of the features on Spotify is when the album you're listening to runs out, they'll just use their algorithm and start playing music in the vein of the artist that you're listening to. And that was how I discovered Tyler Childers. It was through a Sturgill Simpson radio type of format. But I started discovering other artists that were much like those gentlemen, but under the radar, had more of a storytelling folk type of theme to them. And I noticed my music that I was listening to, going to, was more country tinged. Well, my significant other used to pick on me about how I always used to hate country music and I couldn't even tolerate it. And all of a sudden she started noticing that I was listening to more and more country music, as she would call it. And I'd tell her, this isn't country music. And then she would say, you're in denial. This is country music. So I started thinking about it more and more, and realized that she was right. I was listening to a lot of country music, but I was listening to really, really good country music. That is not on the radio. That is under mainstream. And that was always what I used to do, was listen to a lot of music that was under the mainstream radar. Phish has never had radio airplay. Having seen them for 27 years now and 80 some odd shows, you fall in love with them because of the grassroots people that support them through and through and their tape trading. Grateful Dead never had a top 40 radio hit until their end of years, if you will, with Touch of Grey. Yet these artists live on. Heck, if you go back and look at top 40 charting hits from Led Zeppelin, you'll see that there's only a handful. Yet commercial radio has played a lot more day to day, maybe too much of those songs. And the album-oriented tracks, or the deep tracks, are the ones that are usually some of the better ones that are out there and are played nowadays, but they never charted. So I always like to support the underdog and the bands that never saw the mainstream recognition that perhaps they should have. And I think I'm going to feature a lot of that types of things on this podcast. And before I jump into the music, I'm just going to touch on the title of the podcast real quick, and I'm going to call it Your Trip is Short. I've had a very, very interesting 2020. Those that know me know a little bit of what I've gone through, but to try to boil it all down, I discovered, let's say, my true self and perhaps a little bit of a higher calling in 2020 when the world has been on its head. I have invented and reinvented myself a few times over. I'm done living a life with a filter or labels, and I'm going to live a real big life from here on out. I'm going to tell people that are close to me how much they mean to me. I'm going to share everything at any given time to anyone that wants to listen, because it's important to me that I impact lives in many different ways. If it brings a smile to their face, that's fantastic. That's exactly what I'm looking for. If somebody discovers a new band or artist because of what I share, that's awesome. If I'm able to give a gift to somebody, just a small token to say, I appreciate you and thank you, I'm going to do it. And I have many, many more lives to impact. And life is short. Life is very short. And the sooner that you can recognize that and live your big life, the better your life is going to be. And your trip is short. I will go more further into probably a little bit of 2020 in a future episode. I'll probably even talk about where your trip is short comes from. If you're a fish fan and you're still with me at this point, you know where it is, where it comes from. But if you're not, we'll talk more about it. But for the time being, I'm going to get to some music because I really, truly appreciate that you're still with me this far. I like to keep my talking to a minimum from here on out, but really did want to do a little bit of an introduction podcast as well. I didn't want to make it this long, but apparently I've had a few things to say, and I'm hoping that you really appreciate some of these bands and songs that I'm going to lay out here for you that show to me a little bit about what country music is and has been that you may not be aware of. Important people singing about important things and maybe opening your eyes a little bit. So, thank you very much for tuning in to this first edition of the Your Trip is Short podcast. We'll call this episode 1. My name's Eric Lussier. To reach me, you can find me at ericdlussier@gmail.com. Probably even find my phone number if you want to Google me. So thanks for being with me. I truly, truly hope you enjoy some of this music. Please share, like, follow along, and I'll speak to you soon. Your trip is short.